Hey, good morning. Thanks for coming back for day 2. We're excited to see you all again. And I know probably some new faces too that weren't here yesterday. Quick check if folks who are attending virtually with us today, if you can just pop into the chat, if you can hear and if you can see the slides. So we know we're good to go on that front as well. Are we getting some yeses on chat? All right. Excellent. Okay, well, we have another full day for you today. We're going to kick off with Devin and Sherry on direct services. And I know it's a long day and it's day 2, but we our final session of today, we have some of our Office of Mental Health Services folks coming to present with me to talk about behavioral and mental health services in schools. And so I hope you'll stick around for that. So, all right, it's all you guys.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Devin Hogan. You may have seen me yesterday. This is my friend Sherry Moore. We will be talking about direct services this morning. And so we're going to cover what services are already covered in this school-based access program, what components are needed to make a successful paid claim, how to maximize your reimbursement through the program. We'll stop for some frequently asked questions marked with that exclamation point throughout the presentation. And then Sherry will take us through MAXCapture and what documentation is needed there. So you'll see some stars throughout this presentation, and that will be service types that have been affected in this handbook update. So, holy cow.
Wow, that was quick. There you go.
Okay, before we get to those service types, in order to have a billable service, it needs to be covered in Section 3 of the handbook. So within those service types, it needs to be medically necessary in the IEP and the medical authorization form, and the student must have a parental consent on file. Those are the main components of a billable claim. So we talked yesterday about the updated medical authorization form. This slide is more of an overview, like a summary of those changes. We will also be doing a targeted training on this November 21st about the changes to the form and how it affects the screens in MAXCapture. But for now, this details why we needed the changes to the form and how it affects the rest of the program. So it is going to affect the MAXCapture screens and upload template, and it will also affect your interim rates starting with this fiscal year. So there's only going to be one rate for evaluations instead of one for initial and one for reevaluations in each service type. We did cover this more in the handbook updates section, so if you were not able to attend that, we do encourage you to go back and watch the recording once it's available. Goodness gracious. I think we're going to have to do the keyboard. So these first 3 service types here have not, in essence, changed. So this is what the slides will look like for each service type throughout this presentation. It's going to have the same 3 bullets of information and then the units and evaluation information. I'm hoping that these slides will be good in printout. You can have them as a quick reference tool, but we're not going to cover them in too much depth. So if you could advance. As you can see, this shows the exact same format, just different service type, and it has the section reference. Next. And same with physical therapy. I think there's one more that nothing has changed. Speech. And then, okay, so all of those are effectively the same. The billing limits we talked about did change a little bit, but everything else is the same. Assistive devices has changed in the handbook, and that's why we see the star in the corner. So you can be reimbursed for the purchase and the repair of an assistive device. So we talked a little bit about how that repair portion of it affected the authorization form. We need to be able to document the ongoing need of that device, and that is how it's documented. When claiming, it must be transferred to the student. So if you plan on keeping the device, a better option would be to use your FAI funds, purchase the device, and own it. You can then claim those costs at cost settlement. That's another option to get that device. But if you're trying to get a medical assistance claim, interim claim reimbursement, you have to give that to the student. Next slide. So, I'm not sure why this one wasn't with the other ones, but hearing impaired services, as you can see, nothing really has changed. Move on. Oh, I see. Frequently asked questions about this service type. So, one of our providers has a master's degree, but the major was not in the teaching of hearing impaired. How do I know if someone in my LEA is properly credentialed? Anytime you have a question about credentialed providers in your cost pool, you can send that documentation to DHS and we will review. We'll work with Deb to see how it would be reviewed at audit, and we can provide a full response that way. But if we have only hypotheticals, we can only give you a hypothetical back. Nursing services, what I really want to point out here is the medication administration is billed per encounter. It is not billed on units. So when you're logging that, you want to choose the medication administration service, not the nursing service within MAXCapture. Nursing services are billed per unit and can include observation of a student after the medication has been given to the student. So there can be associated nursing services with that medication, but it's billed differently than the actual administration of the med. Moving on. Nurse practitioner services and physician services. The biggest service that they would be submitting for payment would be the review of the child's IEP for medical necessity and signing that authorization form. The student must be present to submit that as a claim. And that is the limited service that can be billed through telehealth. Orientation, mobility, and vision services. This one also did change in the handbook. So we removed the ability to bill this service type through telehealth. And as we talked about yesterday, this was because of a 2023 review of the appropriate service delivery for this service type. Moving on. Personal care. I know that we get a lot of questions about this one. We will have a couple of frequently asked questions in the next slides. Go back, please. But what I want to cover here is that the health-related services is what needs to be logged for PCAs, really for any service type, but we see it most with PCAs. We do not expect to see large blocks of time on a PCA log, so we're not going to see an 8-hour chunk of time on a log or a 4-hour chunk of time on a log, and we'll cover that in the next slides. So, are online CPR certifications acceptable? No, they are not. We did add this to the handbook. Previously, we were not aware of any certifications that were fully online and acceptable. Now we know that there are none. So there has to be a hands-on skills assessment. Are there any privacy concerns about giving you my PCA's high school education credentials? No. You are enrolled Medicaid providers. You are required to provide this information to us when requested. What dates do I enter into MAXCapture for education credentials? Well, presumably they don't expire. So the end date has to be some future date that we're never going to get to, right? So the start date of that credential is their graduation date, if you have it. If you have their graduation month and year, you can use the month, first day of that year. That's acceptable. We do have a sheet reference about how to enter this information and how to reach out if you have questions about your documentation. We know that not everybody has their high school diploma, so please reach out to the resource account if you have any questions. Here we are with the logging. The IEP states the student needs a PCA all day. Why can't I bill for all day? Because only the time spent on allowable health-related services can be billed through MA. We do not expect every minute of the day to be a health-related service. PCAs have to use the bathroom. PCAs have to eat lunch. PCAs have to help students with their math homework or a writing assignment. Now, if it's hand over hand, that's a health-related service that should be logged and submitted. But we do not want to see educational supports on logs. Service minutes, sorry. Service minutes can accumulate throughout the day to make a full unit. So I know that people are concerned that you're not getting a 15-minute chunk of time. That's okay. They can accumulate throughout the day to make full units. If it doesn't make a full unit throughout the day, it won't go through, but we presume that you will get interim payments throughout the year. And if you're claiming regularly, it's not going to affect your overall reimbursement. So physician services is the other one where they can review the IEP for medical necessity, sign the authorization form with the student present. But the note here is to be careful about which service type certain providers are logging and billing, because psychiatrists are technically physicians. They are physicians with a specialty. So if a psychiatrist does an evaluation, it needs to be billed under the psychiatric services. Can you go to the next slide? And not the physician services. You can see that there was the cannot bill evaluations here, and then on the next slide it says can. So be careful which service type you are billing for. As a note, this is the only service type with a 30-minute unit. So if your LEA writes IEPs with units, we got this inquiry recently, can I write the IEP as units frequency? Sure, just be careful that we know when we're reviewing how much of this service the student is getting. Moving on. The same caveat about being careful for which service type that you are billing for can be said for psychological services and social work and counseling services. Can you move between? So these two are very similar service types. There are lots of services within them that are comparable, counseling services as an example. But the providers who can bill for each service type are unique. They're different. So make sure that they are billing within their appropriate service type. Crisis services. So we have a frequently asked question here. Are crisis services limited to a certain diagnosis code? No. So really any service type within the school-based access program is not limited by the diagnosis code. There does need to be an approved diagnosis for the student, but it doesn't have to tie to the service type. What is important with crisis services is that that service type is listed in the student's IEP and medically necessary on the authorization form. I have a drink of water. Click on it. No. Specialized transportation. So this one also gets a star because it's a hot topic this year. So specialized transportation is always billed as an individual service. So it's identified for the individual student, and the presence of other students on that transportation is irrelevant for our purposes. So we've removed that individual and group distinction from the authorization form. We've pulled it out, and of course, we've added that vehicular accommodation. So that's the second bullet here, physically adapted to be billed. Now, we talked a lot about environmental controls as well. Like we said yesterday, we are still getting further guidance from CMS on what that looks like, and we will share information when it's available. Transportation is billed as a one-way or a round trip. So we don't need to know how many minutes the student is on the bus for billing. It's just going to be billed as a one-way or round trip for school-based. Moving on. So on the logs, it indicates R for round trip or O for one way. Can we document this another way, such as using a check mark for each trip, 2 check marks for round trip and 1 for one way? Sure. As long as our reviewers know what services the student received, it's clear, that is totally acceptable. If it's unclear at review, it leaves you open for recoupments. When a student needs a PCA or a nurse on the bus with them, is that considered specialized transportation? We covered this at length yesterday, but the answer is no. That is not specialized transportation. It's the vehicular accommodation and the health-related service at school that makes it specialized transportation. So overall, for all service types, we've gotten this question. Why can we not use other anymore as a therapy method on our provider logs? To us, this does not adequately describe what a student is getting. We need to know what service is being delivered in order for those services to be reimbursable. So make it clear. If there is anything that is not on the log for your particular service type and you would like to see it there, send it in to us and we'll review to add it. We'd be happy to. As long as it's clear that the student is getting the services that they need that are medically necessary, we are happy. So, what makes for a successful claim? We know the students are getting the service. We know that they need it. How do we get paid for it? These are on the LEA level, your requirements. So you need to be enrolled as a provider. You need to sign the LEA agreement. You need to participate in the RMTS. Students require the service and they are documented. And the provider can provide the service. They are properly credentialed and you're doing those preclusion exclusion checks to make sure that they are allowable. Remember that you are an enrolled Medicaid provider, and so you are held to these standards the same as a physician would be or a hospital. So we have these record retentions in place. We have these requirements in place not to be a burden on you. We know that you're unique because you're LEAs, your school districts. We get that. But you are still enrolled Medicaid providers, and we need to hold you to these accounts. On the service level, so these other 3 levels of information also must be present for a successful claim. We need to know everything about the student. They have to have a signed parental consent, signed IEP, MEDOF. We need to know their MAID. We can't bill it if we don't have it. Provider information needs to be in there. And then the service information, it must meet the requirements for its service type. There must be at least one full unit, or if it's billed by encounter, it must meet the requirements of that encounter. And it needs to not be delivered on a holiday, school closure, or a Sunday. Now, the exception to this is when students, early intervention students' evaluations are billed on their 3rd birthday. The system will know and override that rule. That is the date of service that we would be reviewing at audit. So if you're changing it, you're hurting yourself. How do I use this information to maximize my reimbursement? Consistency is your best friend. If you're doing this on a regular basis, a monthly basis, you are showing that these services are needed, that they're being provided, and your each service type will then have a better chance of moving through for cost settlement. When you have consistent claiming, a few missed claims here and there are no big deal. Let's say you accidentally marked this day today as a holiday in MAXCapture. Students are getting services today, but then the services are all denied. Well, we can't allow it to be billed because you notified us that you were closed. But it's not going to have any effect on your overall reimbursement because it's a cost-based program. So as long as you are claiming consistently, you're going to get interim payments for those service types. It's going to be fine. If today was the only day that you decided to submit your claims and you accidentally marked it as a holiday, you're not going to get any interim payments. Those services are not going to go through. Monitoring your exception reports, and Sherry will talk about this later, but that is a huge tip. Your exception reports show services that can still get submitted. So if you're monitoring them regularly, you can keep that cycle moving and get those services paid. Keeping your reimbursement is just as important as getting it. You don't want to end up with an audit that shows that, oh, all services in the personal care service category were inappropriate for the entire fiscal year. You're going to get all of that money for PCA services taken back. So make sure that you are keeping attention on your compliance. Timely filing was a big deal this year, and we thank you all for going through that with us. At this stage, we don't anticipate any further issues with that, but make sure that you are consistently submitting your services so that you don't hit up against those timely filing requirements. We recommend that you submit your services every month, but within 120 days of the date of service. That allows time for exceptions and getting through that claim cycle to be submitted to MA. We have some, that's all right. We have some recommendations here. So underclaiming can put you at risk. We discussed this just a moment ago. If any service category failed to submit any paid claims, then you're not going to have those costs carry through. But overclaiming can also put you in a payback situation where you've received interim payments in excess of your costs. Then you're going to have to pay back your interim payments. That can actually indicate that your providers are fudging numbers. So keep an eye on that as well, because we see a lot of impossible times at audit where they're billing full days when a PCA should be using the bathroom or eating lunch. Only the minutes when a provider is delivering a health-related service should be logged and billed. Go on. We have three major reporting categories. So there's the exception reports, which is SSG data. We have the management reports, which are MA data. And then your FAI transactions are PDE data. The FAI reports do not show a current balance. So if you have any questions about the balance in your FAI account, you can log into FAI and check that, or you can reach out to PDE at the address that's in the handbook. And I'll turn it over to Sherry.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you. I think I got it. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the pitfalls and obstacles that could prevent successful claiming. So sorry. The first one that we're going to talk about, though, and this kind of goes along with making sure that you have all your student information and provider information correctly entered into the system. But I'm here on the screen, you can see that I'm at master data, maintain provider. And what I want to talk to you about is the provider type. So you see that there's a drop down right here. This is also an important part to successful claiming in MAXCapture. And the reason why this is an important part of that is because this is where coordinators will give users the access to the system, specifically the access that they will need to use in whatever way to use the system. So real quickly, a provider is someone who provides direct services to a student. A supervisor is one who supervises and approves those designated providers that they supervise. A supervisor provider has a dual role. They not only have a caseload of students that they provide direct services to, but they also have a roster of providers that they supervise. And with that, and we are going to talk about the different tabs that they'll have access to with that as well. And of course, you, the coordinators, you are like Oz. So you have access to all things except a few. One being able to use on behalf of to create a supervisor's provider roster. That is probably one of the only features that you really don't have access to, and there is a purpose for that. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about what a provider can see. So on this screen, you will see three different screenshots. In the blue ribbon, they have access to three of our tabs. So the first tab is where they can create and update their provider roster. This is also a great place for them to also add the student's diagnosis code. And the reason for that is because it's one less click. I'm a speech language pathologist and I have grown up using MAXCapture, and the clicks are important. The next one is data entry. Sorry, I can't see that far. Data entry is where they're going to enter those direct services that they've provided. And of course, the last screenshot there are the reports that are available to them. Specifically, provider service detail report or snapshot, either one, are great reports for them to run if they want to manage and review the notes that they've entered into the system. And these are going to be the notes that they've entered, not what you've uploaded. They won't have access to that report. We'll talk about that a lot in our next session. I like the provider service detail report mainly because when I did progress notes or progress reporting, I could take Excel and I could see all of those notes that I've printed out or added into the system and create a kind of like I guess a purview of their progress for that quarter or semester. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is the supervisor. So here you see just a small amount of differences with what they can see under those same three tabs. A supervisor will only have access to their supervisor provider roster. And this is where they will need to go in and add those providers that they will be supervising for the duration of the year. Again, coordinators will not be able to do this from your profile to be able to update these on behalf of. Now, under data entry, that's where they will find the service approvals, and they can update, add notes to a service provider's note to give more information about anything that's missing, and as well as approve the services. You'll see that I've highlighted a couple of reports under the report section. So now you'll see a slight difference about what the provider was able to access versus a supervisor. So here, the supervisor is able to manage and review different things that their providers are doing. Specifically, the pending approval summary, which we'll talk about in the next session, and they can pull their provider's roster through that provider roster summary, which will be helpful in case they need to make sure that all the students have been properly added to their provider's roster. And then they can look at the unassigned student list, which I like that. So coordinators, if you are entering the service details on the IEP tab, this is going to be really helpful for supervisors identifying unassigned students on that report there. And the diagnosis list is by service type, and it's the same 14 diagnoses. All right, and then the supervisor provider, yes, they have that dual role, so they both observe and they provide services to students directly. So you can see we have a combination of both what the provider has and what the supervisor has. Last one is you, the Medicaid coordinator. So the coordinator role, you'll see that there are an additional 3 tabs that are available. Security is where coordinators will be able to change a user's password. Now, in this case, we probably want to tell you that you have that forgot password button on the login screen. So if and when you create your providers in your system, be sure that you have an accurate email, because that's how that button will work, so you don't have to do extra work like this. But in the case that the button doesn't work as expected, this is where you can go in and update a provider's password. The next one is the admin tab. So this is for school holidays. School holidays are those non-student days that are for our school age or early interventions districts. This is where you will enter all of those unexpected school closures, like snow days, cyber hacks, pandemic, good boy. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. For our 29 LEAs who provide both EI and SA, I just want to say it's very important that the 2 programs compare their approved school calendar prior to entering any of those dates, because the calendar that's in RMTS for those 29 schools will not communicate with MAXCapture for a reason. And what you want to do is make sure that the only dates that are entered on the admin tab are those dates that apply to both populations. Otherwise, you're going to exclude services on one side or another from being able to go to this through the system, because it'll be marked as a holiday. All right, so if anyone in the room or online are missing this security tab, I just want to point out a couple of things with this. If you do not see the 7th tab on your ribbon, be sure to reach out to one of your other coordinators that have been identified in your LEA's MAXCapture to see if they can log in through their profile and check the box. And that's user password reset button is what the arrow is pointing to. Once they're able to check that box and save it, you should have that security tab. Now, there have been some times when that's not available even to the other coordinators. If that's the predicament that you're in, please send an email to PA support and we can add that button for you. It's very important, coordinators, that you are very careful about who you give access as coordinator. And the reason why is, hello, all of this is accessible to them. So that's why we want to make sure that you have the correct provider profile. Moving on to master data tab. This is where you will enter your maintained student information. So you'll be creating student profiles. You'll be updating their IEP, MED-OFFs, parent consents if that happens, and the MED-OFF for evals, as well as adding your providers and identifying their licenses and other details. Maintain provider roster is here for you. And in this case, you will be able to create a provider's roster using the on behalf functionality to either create the entire roster for your providers or to edit as required for your district. The next one is data entry. You'll see that you do have service capture and service approval capabilities. I suggest that you do not add transportation services under your own profile. I suggest that you designate a designated provider role in your MAXCapture specifically for specialized transportation. That way, when those services that you enter manually, any coordinator in your district will be able to run any of the reports and see the information that's been added for that role, for that service. Other reason for that is I have had several coordinators who have added transportation to their provider role license, and they've also selected service approval required. When that happens, no one can see it, not even you. No coordinator in your district will be able to see it. It will be completely dark ops. So be sure that you're entering that. If you do want to do service approval for specialized transportation, just remember, designate a separate provider type. And then service approval. So service approval, you do have access to approve all services that come through MAXCapture. It's strongly recommended, though, if you're doing this on behalf of another supervisor through your own profile, that you have written documentation of the services where they've signed and dated and credentialed, and then keep those records on file in case of an audit or monitoring event. And lastly, file transfer. File transfer is where you can upload all of the details that we've just discussed. So you can upload under master data, the student's information, student's IEP, student's MED-OFF services, and MED-OFF eval, as well as the provider details and their licenses. The next one is uploading services. So if you're using a third-party vendor, for instance, or you are capturing services on the templates that we've provided, you can upload your services either using overnight process or process now. So overnight process, as what Siva described yesterday, you have 5 files per day of 3,000 or less records in that file can be uploaded on the same day. The next day, you'll find out what the status of that upload was. It's either completed, meaning, yay, everything saved, errored, uh-oh, nothing saved, or partially uploaded. Partially uploaded, that means that some of the records saved, but there were errors on the others that didn't prevent the whole file from being unsaved. It's good to look at those errors and make those corrections and then upload the file with those corrections. And let's go to, and download reports. Okay, so this is where you'll spend a lot of the time. So this school year, once you get all your student information, your provider information in, you will be spending the majority of your time in the download report section, which is where your exceptions reports and your monthly management reports live. And those will be provided to you on a monthly basis. All right, lastly is the report section. So we will be talking about the service details combined report in our next section. The supervisor roster, this is where you can confirm that the designated providers have been added to your supervisors lists. Oops. And then lastly, the student list, provider list, and provider license. Those are specific to just coordinators. All right, so here's a real quick visual on what what happens in a claim cycle. So a claim cycle schedule, thank you, is what tells the progression of a service becoming a claim. So a service is a service when it's initially entered into the system, and when it's sent to Medicaid, it turns into a claim. So services are first entered into MAXCapture. It's recommended that services are entered into the system by the 15th of every month. So you have plenty of time to make any corrections or other pieces that need to be done, such as service approvals. Next, the service dates that are 30 days or prior to the sweep date. So we're going to leave in the tray 30 days, the most current 30 days, but we're going to sweep all the service dates back 30 days back to the beginning of the year. And what happens during that sweep is that the system does what we call initial checks. And those initial checks are looking at the IEP. Does the service dates, are they covered by the IEP, the MED-OFF? Is there a parent consent? Is it a yes or a no? Does the kid have Medicaid ID? At this point, following that edit, the services are either going to be identified as failed the edit, meaning that the service will become suspended or it will be denied, or the service passes. Now, if the service passes, it will move on to Medicaid for reimbursement consideration. They will do their review and decide whether it's denied or approved. If it's approved, yay, you get the money. If it's denied, both of these are going to end up either way on the monthly management report. But if it's denied, it'll give you a reason why. I will tell you specifically that it's more appropriate for you to spend more time on the exceptions report, fixing those errors, than it will be working on the denied claims under monthly management reports. And the reason why is the exception report errors give you more opportunity to make amends, so those services can filter through for reimbursement. The N codes, if you've had any opportunities to research any of those, you'll know it's really hard to pinpoint what exactly kicked that note out, why that claim did not go through. It is possible, however, to resubmit denied claims by Medicaid. However, again, I want to recommend that you focus on those exception words. All right, here's another quick view. So this is just a simple highlight. So your services are entered into Medicaid, a sweep occurs. Services that are suspended will constantly be reswept at every sweep cycle, regardless if a correction is made, until either a correction is made or 180-day timely filing is met. On the other side, services that are denied kind of stop right there unless a correction is if the error is fixed. Here's another way to look at it. And this kind of breaks the cycle of what we're seeing. So as corrections are made, suspended services will go immediately back in the next sweep. If there's no more edits that are caught, it will go on to Medicaid. Now, in the case of the services being denied, corrections can occur, but in denied services, they will need to be re-entered following the corrections either made to MAXCapture or to the service note itself. Denied claims will not be swept at the next sweep cycle. It will follow along with your LEA's assigned sweep cycle. So just keep in mind that there might be a delay, and that's why we want you to have that opportunity to capture those claims specifically when the service is entered more timely and consistently. All right, so we're moving to our first common exception report error, which is CM201. Provider is not licensed on the service date to perform the service. So in this case, the service was provided on April 1st and it was suspended. In this case, the coordinator's first action should be is to open up the provider's license tab. And as you can see here, I have that screenshot on the screen. And looking at this, I'm sure you see some blatant errors in that first one. So let's talk about that. So looking at the first certification, which happens to be the PCA's educational degree, you can see that it's expired first and that the dates aren't correctly identified, right? So what the coordinator would need to do is to update the dates of the degree. And remember, the start date is always going to be the conferral date or the date that the degree was received. And the end date will always be in the future. And we can make that assumption pretty clearly because we're assuming that no one's got their degree online. I mean, illegally online, not through an online program. Sorry. And so let's take a look at the next error. So the CPR has expired. So the date of service was April 1st, and we can see that clearly the CPR license is out. It expired in 2023. So in this case, the coordinator will need to verify that the PCA completed the update for CPR and then update that information. There is another error. So PCAs are the one provider type that does require 3 different certifications in order to be identified as credentialed in MAXCapture. And the last missing item is the first aid certification. So we would want to put in the most current certification for that first aid. And then after this is all done, then those services that were denied specifically for CM 201, those services will be through the next sweep, and you'll be great. All right, so the next error is PA026. PCA services cannot be billed without service approval. In this scenario that I'm highlighting on the screen, this is, you can see here that the service was denied. So the services were provided in April and they were all denied. And the reason why is you can see on the provider's profile for the license that a button was not properly selected. So PCAs always have to have the service approval button selected when the license is identified. And the way that you do this is you go into that provider's license tab, excuse me, and you can select the very first license. Notice here, if you will, that all of these licenses say SA degree, SA CPR, SA first aid. So they are all under the same category of school age. All you need to do is click edit next to that first certification and you select the button that says service approval required, and magic occurs. It will auto-populate yes to the other 2. Now, for those of you that also have early intervention service providers, you will also need to click the first early intervention one because that yes will not auto-populate to a different category. So you do the same thing for the early intervention. All right. So we talked about this error code occurring because services moved through the system and the PCA did not have service approved selected in their license profile. In this case, I want to talk about uploads. So when you're uploading services into MAXCapture and the service approval is not identified on that document, you are going to find that out when you get your exceptions report. The best way to manage that or to monitor that is to clearly look over your uploads specifically for your PCAs and make sure that you have indicated that the approval was completed, the date that it was completed, and who completed it prior to uploading it. Unfortunately, the uploads will not stream into the pending approval summary in order to let you know that approval is waiting, because that is a different part of the system. So that's why I'm asking you to take a moment and just verify that those approval sections have been completed first. Now, we are going to talk about pending approval summary in the next session, but I do want to make sure that you see the supervisor roster report. That would be a great report just to verify that your supervisors have added their providers to their roster and that they are properly managing the services that those providers are putting into the system. We're going to move over to the next one is CM204. IEP is not available. So there's 3 reasons why this code can populate on an exceptions report. There's no IEP entered into the MAXCapture. The IEP start and end dates don't capture the service dates, or the IEP was created or updated after a sweep occurred. And when that last one, let me just keep going. Sorry. The first one. So when you get your exceptions report, your CM204, the first thing that you're going to do is pull up the student's record, specifically their IEP tab. If your tab looks like this, pretty clear what you need to do. If the IEP start date does not match the service date, like in this situation, it is possible that you have a gap in your IEPs. So when that occurs, just know that those services are gonna fall off at the 180-day timeline. And the last one is when a IEP was created or updated after the sweep. So it is possible that you have updated over 300 different students' IEPs and probably don't remember the specific date that you did that on. But then you find out that, hey, Johnny Little, I did his IEP, I know it. The sweep comes back, the exception report shows that this error code is there. What you will do is you'll run the student list, select IEP data, and you can see here that based on the sweep date of March 28th, the IEP, some update occurred the next month. So it occurred after the sweep had occurred. So when those types of changes are clearly visible to you, you know that those services will sweep at the next sweep cycle, and there's nothing more that you need to do. All right, the next one is our MEDOF. MEDOF has 4 different reasons. So if you have CM202 showing on your exceptions report, it could be because there is no MEDOF listed in MAXCapture, or the authorization start and end dates don't cover the service dates, or the MEDOF doesn't match the services that were entered into the system. And again, or the MEDOF was created or updated after a sweep cycle. Same thing applies as we discussed for the IEP. The first thing you'll do is check that MEDOF tab for the students that error showed on. If the MEDOF is missing, such as this, you'll try to find that MEDOF. If the MEDOF is found, you'll enter the services in. Otherwise, you know that these services that apply to this error code and this part of the issue will fall off at the 180-day timely filing date. All right, so the MEDOF is not available for the service date. Again, we see here that there's a gap. I think this is more plausible than the IEP one, because you guys probably are getting those IEPs done before the expiration date. But it is possible that service dates are entered into the system, but there is a gap between the original MEDOF and the updated MEDOF. And next is that the services on the MED-OFF don't match what was entered into the system. So MAXCapture is very specific in its edits. Not only does it look at the type of service, but it's also looking at how the service is provided. So in this case, I can't see that far. There is a service that's entered, but it doesn't match what's on the MED-OFF. Perhaps it was an individual service. Yeah, that was on the MED-OFF and group was selected. This would be, if you're seeing this pretty commonly for a specific provider, this may warrant a conversation with that provider to find out what's happening. Why is the IEP not being followed? Why, or specifically if it's a group service and the student's always seen individual, this could represent something more than just an issue with the MED-OFF. It could be that a conversation needs to occur because the services aren't being properly given and you're giving a more restrictive service type. Moving on. Next one is the MED-OFF was created or updated after the sweep cycle. And here you see I've run the same report. So this is the student list report, but instead of selecting IEP data, I selected MED-OFF services. And you can see here that the service, the MED-OFF was created and updated on the same day, August 8th, which is after the sweep date of August 5th. I did it. I survived my first session. Today we discussed the covered services under the SBAP program. We talked about successful components for successful claiming, as well as how to maximize your reimbursement. We discussed frequently asked questions and successful documentation through MAXCapture. If you have additional questions after this presentation, I would love for you to reach out to DHS using the RAPW SBAP email, or if you have specific questions for SSG or myself, you can reach out to SSG's help desk. There is a survey link. I would really like to know your feedback specifically for future trainings. And if you have any questions, I don't know if I talked over, maybe we have 2 minutes left. I'm so sorry. We'll open up for questions.